I certainly was looking forward to, and I'm sure you are going to enjoy our guest speaker tonight. He's a graduate of Yale and Berkeley, two of the hottest institutions in America for undergraduate and graduate study. He's an investor, advisor, and author, and CEO of J.E. Berman Associates, and a fellow of the Millikan Institute. He spends his time advising numerous global Fortune 500 companies on their entry and operations in emerging and frontier markets, focusing on their political and economic dynamics that drive shareholder value. His clients include global leaders in oil, gas, mining, agribusiness, education, healthcare, IT, consumer goods, etc. He has, in fact, spent several occasions coming to Nigeria in that role, advising some of these important clients. And his first book is Success in Africa. It's about the fastest growing markets in the world and the CEOs who succeed there. And no less a person than President Clinton, who of course is very familiar with Nigeria, called it an important and timely book. He's exactly the sort of person that FBN Quest would want to hear from tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Mr. Jonathan Berman.
Thank you. Don't turn on. Thank you. Thank you. Well, I didn't know I was going to be introduced as a smooth operator. I don't know if that's for good or ill. And as you'll see, I'm not so smooth as I once was. So thank you for those kind words, and thank you to FBN Quest for having me on this, the launch of their day. I suppose this is sort of their first birthday in a way. Now, as you may have surmised, I am not Nigerian, nor even African. I'm a New Yorker from the States, and I come from a land where most people know Africa from Oxfam appeals and from the Lion King, you know? Africa is a place of happy animals and miserable people to most of the people I know. And while I'm not immune to those ideas, you know, I'm subject to them even for much of my professional career. I didn't start life as an Africa expert. I came out of college as an Asia expert and spent out of college, how much of an expert are you really? But I came out knowing something about Asia and spent the next 10 years or so consulting as a management consultant in and around Greater China. And it was only in the last decade that I came to Africa. And a client asked me to come by virtue of some large gas find they found. And the first country I came to in Africa actually was Equatorial Guinea, which didn't exactly put to rest all the images that I had imagined once about Africa. But then I came to Lagos not long after that, and I really began to see the amount of energy and vitality that was on the continent that's being celebrated here tonight, right? And I also began to see that there were not just enterprises didn't exist just of, you know, a man and his ox, a woman and her sewing machine, again, like you might see in the Oxford appeals, the Oxfam appeals, that in fact there are managers of tremendous talent, global talent here in Africa, and companies that are amongst the most dynamic of any I've seen on any continent. My friends at Abraj have estimated there's some 6,000 companies over $50 million in revenue annually here in Africa. And there are 400 companies making $1 billion or more on the continent, according to McKinsey. But since we're talking over dinner, I'm not going to disturb you with too many more statistics beyond that. They tend to cause the digestion to suffer. So what I'd like to talk about mostly are people. Extraordinary business leaders I've met who embody some of the characteristics that FNB Quest has been speaking about, that our managing director has been speaking about today. And sort of chief among these is trailblazing, something that I think FBN Quest seeks to emulate. And what I want to do is be true to the vision of the day, of getting beyond rhetoric, and both celebrating these ideals, but also talking at a very practical level about what it means, what these words mean. So what does it mean to trailblaze? Well, what it doesn't mean. So last week, Jamie Dimon made some news. Jamie, as you may know, is the chairman of JP Morgan Chase and probably the most powerful banker in America. And he made news announcing that Chase would continue opening offices in Africa to serve, as he put it, our clients who are growing there and some large institutions, organizations like Procter & Gamble, very old stable institutions in the US. So he's taking the clients and the business model that has made him successful in the US and applying it here. Now, I think very highly of Jamie, but that is not trailblazing. I happen to also think it won't work in Africa, but that's another story. But it's without a doubt not trailblazing. To me, trailblazing means new customers, new products, new markets, and most challenging, new models. So this guy is trailblazing. He's Vimal Shah, the CEO of Nairobi-based Bidco. And just can I ask, how many people in the audience are familiar with Vimal Shah or Bidco? So not very many, and that's very good. Because one of the other things I've learned working here in the last decade is that you don't want to tell a room full of Nigerians something that they already know. Right? They tend not to tolerate the boredom of that. So for that reason, I hope you'll indulge me as I discuss some successful leaders from elsewhere around the continent and a little bit beyond who hold lessons for us, like I think Vimal Shah does. So Vimal started his company with his father, this company Bidco, and at first they made soap. Building on the trust with housewives that they built over a decade, they grew into edible oils. And that was the business for a long while. It was a good business, and it was the business when Vimal took over the firm. It has a straightforward business model, like Jamie Dimon's. But that wasn't enough for Vimal, because he is truly a trailblazer. Demand for his product was rising, edible oils, but raw materials for those oils were coming entirely from Asia, and especially palm oil. Despite enormous demand, the fastest growing demand in the world for palm oil is in Africa, including right here in Nigeria. So in 2002, Vimal did what no one in his industry does. He went upstream, and he went upstream in a huge way. He acquired 30,000 hectares of land, and it was not plantation land, it was completely undeveloped. And it wasn't in his native Kenya, it was in Uganda. And this is a guy who had never farmed or owned an acre of plantation land in his life. Today, those palm trees are producing commercial crops, feeding into his processing plants and all the other plants in East Africa that used to be supplied only from Asia. So that's the quality of trailblazing that I've seen succeed in Africa, and the quality of leaders in whom I think it's worth investing. Of course, blazing a new trail that way carries big risks. What characteristics cause those risks to pay off? When you're the first to deploy a new model or enter a new market or reach new customers, how do you manage those risks? So you can talk about that in a lot of ways. In a book I wrote, I talked about it as 5 particular aspects of success that exist in frontier markets or moving in or operating in a frontier environment like this one. But since this is designed to be a short talk, let's consolidate that to 3 from 5. I'm going to say that if you stay in touch, if you stay in sync or in touch with your customers, if you empower your team and prove impactful on the big issues surrounding your team and your customers, then there's a good chance that you'll reap the rewards from that kind of trailblazing. Thank you. Well, it's easy to talk about, right? It's a little harder to do. But let's look briefly at who's doing each. And I'm hoping that these examples will inspire to a certain extent. These men and women certainly inspire me, but I hope they'll also serve as a challenge to FBN Quest to live the life that it's purporting to lead, and to all of us to do what we can do on this extraordinary continent. The clicker has gone. There we are. So let me start with being in sync, and I'll talk for now with being in sync with the customer base around you. I know few business leaders on any continent who are more in sync with their customer than this man, James Mwangi. So James Mwangi is the CEO of Equity Bank. James' story at Equity Bank is well known. His reinvention of a bankrupt savings and loan into a bank serving the base of the pyramid and then becoming the most profitable in East Africa. But James's earlier life is less well known, and he spent some time talking to me about it. James started life in a rural community where he delivered coal after school to make ends meet, and eventually he moved up from delivering coal to fruit, moving up into higher value goods. And he knew from that experience that the people around him, the people in that rural community, were not without money. They were just unwilling to have it far from them. Our people, he once told me, our people, their lives are unplanned, and so they want their money nearby. And it's just sort of a quality of insight that a quality of proximity, of spirit to their customer base that I don't often hear, frankly, from Western executives. And it's one that was critical to the success of Equity Bank. So a bank branch was certainly too far for most of that customer base. It was also too impersonal. James told me he'll never cross that threshold, the small farmer or the day laborer. You have to serve him where he's comfortable. And that was the birth of Equity's agency banking, a seed and equipment salesman in a rural area that's also a bank. It has none of the trappings of a bank, but this year Equity will do more than 100 times the transactions in a branch they'll complete in this agency. It's close to the customer. It's in sync with the customer. And you can cross borders and still be in sync. This is the headquarters of Samsung Africa. It's on Nairobi's Lutulu Avenue. Now, one thing you'll notice, Samsung is not prominently displayed. They're in there, but that's because their sign is obscured by the hustle of this street. Lutulu is lined with street-level electronic vendors, and it's where people go in Nairobi to try new phones and gadgets, compare prices, and do their real shopping. I've bought phones on Lutulu Avenue. It's where Samsung wants to be. By contrast, here is Apple's Africa headquarters. It's beautiful, right? But it's a bit pristine and isolated and uninformed by anything at its doorstep. Indeed, the only person nearby is this fellow. So I'm told that this person in front, I don't know if those in the back can see, I'm told this person in front is the Greek hero Hermes. Maybe so, but I doubt Apple will ever learn as much from him as Samsung does from their neighbors. So in my view, Apple is suffering because they think. One more example, and then we'll move on from this one. Recently, I invested in a company called Asoko Insight. So Asoko is a simple thing. It brings Africa's corporate data to investors worldwide via an online platform. And when the founders asked me to invest and serve on the board, I asked why there would ever be room for them. I mean, wouldn't D&B or Bloomberg and the other large data players fill in that space? Well, it turns out they won't. And they won't because gathering reliable data on African companies means building relationships with the executives of those companies, winning their trust, and therefore winning their data. It means putting people on the ground. It means being in sync with men like this man. This is Ken Njoroge, the CEO of Cellulant, a mid-sized, highly successful producer of mobile payment systems. It's a strong, investable business, Ken's, but you'd never get to Ken with an algorithm. You have to engage him. And the global data companies like Bloomberg aren't built for that, for anything like that. And so as a result, they and S&P, Capital IQ, and together cover about 400 companies worldwide. 400 companies across the continent. 400 companies. And remember, there are about 6,000 with 50 million or more in revenue. Asoko Insight goes live with the data they're collecting in just this way later this year, and with about 1,200 companies, it'll grow to 8,000. And it's the only way that the information on Ken reaches Wall Street or London or any other major financial capital worldwide. That's what you get by being in sync. That's the potential global growth that comes from being in sync in a frontier market and being a true trailblazer. Now, staying in sync with your environs gets a lot harder when you're big. FBN Quest is a big company, but has aspirations to stay in sync. A lot of the companies I've met today are large companies, but I imagine they have the same kind of aspiration to stay in sync. Top leadership is far from some of your markets, and it's easy to lose touch. Trailblazing can be a very dangerous proposition when you lose touch, very, very dangerous to the bottom line. And so the success I've seen in Africa and elsewhere comes from empowering your team to be close to the customer and have decision-making authority. Empowerment of local managers to do their job independently of the mothership. And a company that's great at that, actually, is one of Africa's homegrown successes, SAB Miller. They make Star and Castle, among other brands around the world. They make Miller beer, one of the most popular beers in my country. And to this day, they make 13% of their EBITDA worldwide from Africa. The man who really led them in that expansive cross-border growth was their longtime chairman and CEO, Graham, enjoying the product, doing a little quality control. Graham really believed in Africa as a continent when his company was still very much a South African company, and the prospects that Africa held for growth, but he knew he couldn't manage that from Johannesburg or from London, and so he ensured that every local brewery was run independently. Eventually, he found in that a great training ground for his managers, including the manager that eventually succeeded him when he passed away about 3 years ago, and the new CEO came on board. He came through just such a training ground in remote breweries across Africa. Graham would empower those brewery managers to run the country operation with no interference, but also be responsible for problems large and small. One manager encountered a problem when he found persistent overstock of Cobra, but it wasn't this kind of Cobra, this kind of Cobra. It turns out that cobras like to coil up in the bottom of beer crates, and it fell to the newly empowered manager to flip them out. So Graham always delighted in telling this story. I actually took a picture of him telling me this story because he got very animated about it. First of all, because he thought it was funny, but also because it's stuck in people's minds as an emblem of the sort of soup to nuts empowerment and responsibility that he was trying to foster. I'd like to tell one other story about empowerment that comes actually from outside of business, but it reminded me so much of Graham's story and so much of what I had seen that's needed to be a trailblazer that I thought it was worth mentioning. So recently, another leader shared with me a similar perspective. David Petraeus, who you see here on the left, is probably the most famous Army general of our generation. You may recognize the guy on the other side. Oh, David's on the right, facing this way. You may recognize the fellow on the left. But before he was famous outside the US Army for success in battle, he was famous inside the Army for his stint off the battlefield, where he was tasked to develop a modern approach to capturing and holding new territory. Now, I recognize I'm speaking in military terms, but I think anybody who's tried to launch a new office of their business, move into a new market, into a new country, even move into a new customer base, knows what it means about capturing and holding the new territory. You see, in the counterinsurgency that David was planning for, every division, every battalion, and every company and platoon needs to be able to quickly distinguish between whether they'll be met with a handshake or a hand grenade, and they need to have the authority to react based on that, something you can't dictate from central command. So David reorganized command around what's called the strategic corporal, the most junior commander of troops in the Army. And he empowered that corporal to make the decisions that would win or lose the war. In fact, he had a saying in his command, generals don't make the decisions that win wars. You can imagine how that went over with the general staff. I'd say that's the degree of empowerment you need to succeed when your people are far from headquarters blazing trails. And I find, you know, as someone who helped manage a global firm, my consulting firm Dahlberg was in 14 countries, and as one of the senior partners, it was tough to empower managers in those spaces to make all their own decisions. It was unquestionably the right decision, and when we didn't do it, we felt the consequences of it. So, beyond being in sync with your environs and empowering your people, there's one last characteristic of successful trailblazers that I've discussed with you, and it's being. So when I talk about being impactful, some executives have this bad habit of sending me down the hall to sustainability or the CSR department. When I say being impactful is necessary to success, I don't mean CSR or philanthropy alone. Those have their role. But what I mean is engagement in big issues that define the company. They define the company, they define its core business lines, and who comes to work for it. And let me give an example. So I once went up to Harvard Business School to meet with the African students currently enrolled there. There's an incredibly talented group of young people, driven, really humbling to be with them. And I asked how many were planning to return to their home nations to study, and nearly all were. I don't think that'll surprise most people in this room. And of those who were returning, I asked how many were, I asked them what executive anywhere in Africa they really admired. And do you know who most of them said? It wasn't Aliko Dangote, it wasn't Fatuma Naleko at MTN or Cyril Ramaphosa or any other truly big name across the continent. The biggest draw was this woman, Funke Opeke of Main One. Now, I know, doesn't she merit some applause? Exactly. And I know I'm breaking my own rule by bringing coals to Newcastle, but you know, Funke deserves her props, right? She's an extraordinary leader. They admire Funke and Main One, not for the CSR it undertakes. I actually don't know what their CSR program is, but for the core activities of the company. They admire the technological prowess. This is the Main One cable linking up to the Singapore Epsilon high-speed underseas cable. They admire the ability to bring Nigeria to the next century. So this is the Main One Leke data center, the first data center of its kind inside Nigeria, and indeed in all of West Africa. And they admire where all this ultimately leads, to an informed, empowered next generation of Nigerians. So that's a story that builds the investor base, it builds the employee base, and the common culture necessary to blaze a new trail. Another example of this, and I'll try to be short and get to conclusion because I know we want to continue our meal. Another example of this kind of impactful business is Safaricom. Now, we all know the story of M-Pesa and possibly also of M-Kopa, the solar power solution that Safaricom offers. But the core of the impactful story at Safaricom actually begins much earlier and much more rooted in the original business of telco when Michael Joseph took over as CEO. So upon arrival, Michael tells you that he changed two things sort of the day he arrived. He stopped rounding up bills to the next minute, and he built a 24-hour help desk. And no one was doing either in Kenya and indeed anywhere in Africa at that time. And for good reason, because in one swoop, Michael cut his revenues by not rounding up to the minute and raised his costs by building this 24-hour center. You know, his board certainly called him to task on that combination decision in his first week in office. But disaster loomed but didn't come. Instead, what came were customers, because no one else was really going after. And that help desk is an exceptionally good story about that. So he set up this 24/7 help desk because he knew that most of the customers in Kenya wouldn't bother reading the instructions. Even if they could read them, they wouldn't bother to read the instructions for their phone, but they would call. And so he wanted to retain them as customers, and they called. And after a couple weeks, the manager of the call center comes to Michael Joseph and says, "Boss, we've got a problem. The customers from all the other phone companies are calling into our call center and asking us how to use their phones." Well, Michael knew well. He said, "That's not a problem. Make sure we service those customers." And sure enough, the vast majority of those customers became Safaricom customers. So this is the kind of engagement and having impact on people's lives that wasn't as a function of philanthropy. It was core to the business and core to growing Safaricom into the 70% market share that it has today. So these are impactful businesses, not only or even primarily in their CSR, but in how they're driving their core business. And I find myself challenged when I come to do business in Africa to stay true to that. You know, I'll give one more example of that, actually, and it's further on down the line. So the culture of being impactful has stayed with Safaricom, and it's stayed into the tenure of its current CEO, Bob Collymore. This is a picture of Bob not suffering fools gladly. That is a common aspect of Bob Collymore. And I once was engaged with Bob in the exploration of an education venture where an American company that had beautiful education materials came to realize they could digitize these and move these into Africa, and specifically, and because they knew Safaricom, they went to Bob and they said, we can deliver this fabulous education product, and it really will price it for the aspiring upper class of Kenya, really the wealthy and the soon-to-be wealthy of Kenya. And that may be a small number, but that's who we'll market as a premium product. We went back and forth on that a bit, but eventually Bob said no. And Bob said no for the best reason. He said no because he said, listen, how we got to where we are is by developing products that serve all of Kenya, that serve all our customer base. And we're going to stick with that. And so he declined on this product that was very attractive in many ways and certainly would have made Safaricom some money. But I think in the long term, this is at the root of the business decisions and the business culture at Safaricom. I think it really challenges us when we talk about being impactful to see whether that is really what we mean. In the core, is our core business driving, as Funke's is, as Bob's is, towards impactfully addressing the big challenges around us. So with that, I think I'd like to just sort of draw back to trailblazing. And I wonder if we could skip, I guess I have control of this. We'll skip to slide 9 of that. I'll come back to this if you guys have questions about that. But I want to just talk about where I think all this leads us, right? Where does this take us, all this, if we're in sync, empowering and impactful in our business, where can it go? Well, what I've seen and what I know is that it can yield growth and opportunity in this continent that goes clear across the globe. And I'll just give a couple examples to conclude with. So credit scoring in the US is a decrepit sector, and I would argue collapsing. It's artificially supported by 3 rotting pillars. They're called Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, the 3 big credit reporting bureaus, but that have existed for decades and basically operate as they did when I was 12, when I first began to get a credit score. But massive identity theft and abuse by creditors and just underperforming and unchallenged algorithms make that system ripe for disruption. Now these are titans, these are all multi-billion-dollar companies. But I want you to consider Volo, a Senegalese company that uses biometrics to obtain better credit scoring and virtually eliminate consumer fraud and identity theft. Volo just beat out Experian, one of those big just beat out Experian to win the concession for the first credit bureau in the West African Monetary Union. And Volo didn't just win on price, as you might expect. They won on the technical merit, on the technical proposal. Now, Volo may succeed or not. They're a young company, and this is experimental. But the quality of credit innovation coming out of Africa is extraordinary. And I assure you, 15 years from now, we'll trace back how credit is done worldwide back to one of the trailblazers on this continent. And even today, the world beats a path to Africa for its innovation. Consider FBN Corporation from Canada. This is a world-class health technology company. The founder's last company built the software for every MRI machine on the planet. So it comes from a strong pedigree. FBN does something a little different. It solves for 2 big problems. One is that most healthcare workers have no supervision, and the second is that most healthcare systems have no data. And if you think about a system in which the workers have no supervision and the system owners have no data, that's a system that's broken for sure, wasting money for sure, and an opportunity for both profit and to make a big difference. FBN technology delivers better guidance to the health worker while gathering better data and giving it back to the healthcare provider, whether they're public or private, local or global. And the pilots indicate it saves about 25% per patient. 25% of healthcare costs can be saved by deploying this system with better data and just marginally better care. It's literally one of the 2 or 3 most disruptive medical technologies in the world. And it's being deployed first here in Africa, including in Nigeria, where they're just getting their license now to do their first pilot run. The reason it's being deployed in Nigeria and elsewhere in Africa is simple. The health community here welcomes it. Governments, insurers, and health clinics in 6 countries across the continent are using it. In the US and in Europe, the health industry is not ready for this. In fact, they're entrenched against it. They're entrenched with incumbents and regulations that protect those incumbents. And even the big Western donors only discovered FEO after African governments and healthcare providers did. The big Western donors discovered it when they really had to, during the Ebola crisis. So one of the things that FEO does is it's able to take rapid diagnostic tests and process them more effectively in the field than any other technology in the world. That's the device that Ghanaian technologist is using right there. That's a DECI reader, and that is the most advanced rapid diagnostic testing anywhere in the world, being deployed only here in Africa now. Now, Ebola brought it to the attention of the West. I'm a little sorry to say that it took that much for us to pay attention. But we're so this is a repeating theme I see, where you have entrenched incumbents, you have existing systems that are good enough for the West, but those systems don't exist here. And so the opportunity for companies, for both African companies like Volo out of Senegal and international companies like FEO out of Canada to come here and develop world-beating technologies, technologies that will eventually grow back to the rest of the world, is extraordinary in situations where there isn't an entrenched incumbency. And that, to me, is the opportunity of a true trailblazer. Africa has the benefit of not having to clear the deck for the trailblazers. The deck's already clear. And if they stay clear, the trailblazers who are in sync with their environs, empower their people, and have a big impact on the big challenges around them, will provide opportunities here that I imagine I'll be investing in and working on for decades to come. So those are my thoughts, just a little bit on trailblazing. Thank you very much for your time, and I appreciate being invited to join you.